The rain came down sideways that night, the way it only did in that particular valley, warm and red, where it met the clay. He could hear it on the leaves above him, a sound like static, like a radio dying. The man he was dragging weighed more than anything he had ever carried, and his arms had stopped feeling like his arms an hour ago, and the mud pulled at his boots with every step, as though the earth itself had decided this was far enough. This was where both of them would stay. But the man was still breathing, shallow, ragged, each breath separated from the last by a silence long enough to make you count, but breathing. So he kept moving. Left knee down, right boot planted pull. Left knee down, right boot planted pull. The rain filled the grooves his knees left in the mud and erased them before he had moved 3 feet, as though none of this was happening, as though the jungle had already decided to forget. He did not look back at the man's face. He had learned early that you did not look at their faces when you were the one doing the pulling. You looked at where you were going. You fixed your eyes on the dark space between two trees 30 yards ahead, and you pulled toward that space, and when you reached it, you found the next dark space and you pulled toward that one. 30 yards, then 30 more. That was the only arithmetic that mattered. The hands doing the pulling were 25 years old that night. They did not know yet what they would become. They did not know about the arthritis that would come in the left index finger starting around age 50, or the way the skin would thin over the knuckles, until every vein showed blue and distinct like rivers on an old map. They did not know that 60 years later, those same hands would be resting on a table in Kentucky, holding a glass of beer in the yellow light of a room that smelled of old wood and something close to peace. They only knew the mud, the weight, the 30 yards. Walter Briggs set his glass down on the table and looked at his hands. The Pilsner caught the bar light and held it amber and still. The foam had mostly settled, just a thin white ring around the inside of the glass, and he watched it for a moment, the way a man watches something he has looked at so many times. It no longer requires thought, only presence. His hands on the table were exactly what they were. Gnarled at the knuckles, the skin loose and spotted with age. The left cuff of his tweed jacket had ridden up slightly, exposing the inside of his wrist, where a faded anchor tattoo had blurred over decades into something almost abstract, a blue-gray shadow that a stranger might not recognize as anything at all. A man who knew what to look for would recognize it immediately. Walter pulled his cuff back down. He was 82 years old, and he sat in the same chair every Tuesday and Thursday at the same corner table at VFW Post 724 on the corner of Millbrook and Sycamore in Harlan, Kentucky. The table was small and square with a ring stain on one corner that had been there since before he started coming here 17 years ago. The wall behind him was exposed brick dark red, and above his head hung a framed photograph of men standing in front of a Huey, squinting into a sun that no longer existed in any sky. He had looked at that photograph many times. He did not know the men in it, but he recognized the way they were standing. The bar stools along the front were about half full on this particular Thursday. A television mounted in the corner above the liquor shelf was showing a college football game with the sound turned low. Someone had taped a hand-lettered sign to the dartboard that said, "Out of order," and the sign had been there for at least 3 months. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, not quite keeping up with the work it had been asked to do. None of this required Walter's attention. He poured it anyway, the slow, easy attention of a man who had spent decades learning that the room you were in was always worth knowing. Dennis Keller had been behind the bar for 11 years. 58 years old, gray-brown hair, cut close, a white dish towel perpetually over his left shoulder as though it had grown there. He had served with the 1st Infantry Division in Kuwait in 1991, combat engineer, and he carried that time the way most men who had actually been there carried it, which was quietly and without drama, and only occasionally in the middle of the night when something snagged on something else and pulled. He was wiping down the far end of the bar when the door opened and Walter came in at exactly 4 in the afternoon, as he always did, as he had done for 17 years. Dennis did not look up from the bar. Afternoon, Walter. Afternoon, Dennis. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Walter hung his jacket on the hook beside the table and sat down. Dennis already had the Pilsner pulled and on the bar before Walter had fully settled into the chair. He did not bring it over. He set it on the bar, and a moment later Walter was there to collect it, and then he was back at his corner table with his glass and his folded newspaper and the particular quality of silence that he carried with him, the way other men carry wallets. George Monroe was at his usual table near the window, the one with the view of the parking lot and the maple tree that had been losing the same dead branch to the wind for going on 2 seasons now. George was 79 years old. He had gone to Vietnam in 1966 at 20 years old and come back in 1968 with a prosthetic left knee and a way of moving through the world that was neither fast nor slow, but simply deliberate, as though he had decided at some point that each step was worth making correctly. He wore his navy blazer with the brass buttons that had gone slightly green at the edges, and his flat cap was on the table to his left, in the same spot it occupied every time set down with the same small precision brim facing the window. The two men looked at each other across the room. They had been doing this for 12 years. A nod. Nothing more. A nod that carried inside it everything two men needed to say when they already understood each other past the point where words added anything. Pamela Dixon was at the table near the center post reading something on her phone, with her coffee going cold beside it. She was 44 years old, compact and square-shouldered, with short brown hair and green eyes that had a habit of narrowing slightly when she was thinking, the reflex of someone who had spent years reading terrain in bad light. 2 tours in Afghanistan, Sergeant Combat Support. She knew the Korengal Valley the way you know a place that has tried to kill you, which is to say completely and permanently, and in ways you could not explain to someone who had never been there. She had been coming to Post 724 for about 8 months now. She did not usually stay long. She came for the coffee and the quiet and the specific comfort of being in a room where nobody asked her to explain herself. She was 3 paragraphs into whatever she was reading when she realized she had read the same 3 paragraphs 4 times. She set her phone face down on the table and picked up her coffee and thought about nothing in particular for a while, which was its own kind of work. That was the room as it had been for years. That was the room before Brandon Holden. He had appeared on a Friday evening in early August, which was unusual because Friday evenings tended to bring in people who were loud in ways that Post 724 was not built for, and so the regulars generally came on weekdays. He came through the door at 6:15, paused just inside the entrance, the way people pause when they are reading a new room, and then walked to the bar with the easy ownership of a man who has decided in advance that he belongs wherever he happens to be standing. He was 38 years old, medium height, broad through the shoulders, wearing cargo pants and coyote tan that had never seen anything dirtier than a parking lot, and a black baseball cap with the Marine Force reconnaissance insignia on the front, the eagle and globe and anchor rendered in silver thread. The cap was tilted slightly left. He wore it like a man who wanted you to notice that he barely noticed it himself. He ordered a Budweiser and told Dennis he had just moved to Harlan from out west and that he had heard this was a good post. Dennis gave him the beer and took his money and told him what he told anyone who asked that question, which was that it was the kind of place where people came to drink beer. The man laughed. It was a good laugh, warm and self-deprecating, the laugh of someone who understood that the first impression was a door and you needed to open it without breaking anything. He asked about the older veterans at the tables, asked it with visible respect. Nodded when Dennis said Korea and Vietnam said something about standing on the shoulders of giants that was slightly too polished to be spontaneous, but not polished enough that most people would notice. He stayed for 1 hour, talked to 3 people, bought nobody a drink, left a good tip, said he would be back. He was back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and every Thursday in between. Walter watched him from the corner the way Walter watched everything, which was completely and without appearance of watching. He watched the way the man constructed his stories, the way he let the first details be small and credible before the larger ones arrived. He watched the way the man identified who was listening hardest and then directed the next sentence toward them without being obvious about it. He watched the economy of it, the patience the way it was built rather than told. He had seen men like this before, not often, but often enough. By the 3rd week, Brandon Holden had names for most of the regulars and was using them naturally, the casual familiarity of someone who had been here months already. By the 4th week, he was buying rounds for the younger members who came in on Thursday evenings. By the 6th week, he had found Travis Weaver. Travis came in on a Thursday at the end of September, a few minutes after 5. He was 26 years old, and he had been out of the Army for 8 months after 2 deployments, one to Mosul and one to Coast Province, and he had not fully figured out yet what he was supposed to do with himself in the space that had been left behind. He worked at an auto shop on the east side of town, good with his hands, and the work was honest and the hours were regular, and he was grateful for both of those things in a way he could not quite say out loud. But the work stopped at 5, and the evenings were long and quiet in a way that the evenings in Coast had never been, and quiet had turned out to be harder than noise. He chose a table against the back wall, sat with his back to it, His eyes swept the room before he sat down, cataloging exits and occupants in under 3 seconds, and then he made himself stop doing that and look at the baseball game on the television instead. He ordered a beer and drank half of it and watched the game and did not watch the game. Brandon Holden materialized beside him with 2 beers and pulled out a chair without asking. He said he could tell Travis had just come home. Said it the way a doctor states a diagnosis, not unkindly. Said 8 months out was the strange territory, the part nobody warned you about, too far from it to explain, and not far enough to understand. Travis looked at him for a long moment, measuring. Then he said both. Iraq and Afghanistan, 101st. And Brandon nodded the way someone nods when they already knew. He said he had done 3 tours. Force Recon, Korangal Kunar, the mountains along the Pakistani border, where the wind came off the peaks cold enough to turn water to ice, in an open canteen by midnight. He said it without drama, the flat recitation of someone reporting facts. He said he understood what it was like to sit in a room full of people and feel like you were watching them through glass. Travis did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, yeah, that was all. That single word and the length of the pause before it were enough. Over the following weeks, Travis became part of the group that assembled around Brandon on Thursday evenings. There were 5 of them at the regular peak, maybe 7 on a good night. Cody and Marcus, 2 men in their early 30s, who had not served but who liked the energy Brandon brought to a room that had previously run at the frequency of a library. Earl Gallagher, a machinist in his 40s who came in after his shift and mostly listened. A man named Ray, who appeared 2 or 3 times and then stopped coming. And Travis, who sat closest to Brandon and who had gradually begun to seem to those watching from a distance like a man who had handed something over and was not entirely sure what he had given away. Brandon's stories grew larger by increments. That was the craft of it. Each week the new installment arrived with 1 or 2 details that pushed slightly further than the previous version. And by the time the push became a stretch and the stretch became an impossibility, the audience had already accepted the architecture of the whole thing and was not in the habit of examining individual bricks. He described an 8-day reconnaissance mission in Kunar province with such specific detail about the terrain, the vegetation, the temperature at altitude, that even Pamela Dixon, half listening from her table by the post, found herself following the geography before she realized she was doing it. And then he described the approach route. She set her coffee cup down. The approach he was describing came from the northwest across a ridgeline that he called the Broken Saw. She knew that ridgeline. She knew it because, in the spring of 2009, she had sat at a planning table at Faux Bostic and watched that exact approach get removed from every operational plan for the entire season because the northern face had been compromised by an IED cell that had mined the goat paths so thoroughly that no one was moving through there until EOD had a full rotation dedicated to it. No unit went that way. Not infantry, not support, not special operations. Nobody crossed the Broken Saw from the north in the spring of 2009. She knew this because her unit had provided the logistical assessment that recommended the route cancellation. She looked at Brandon from across the room. He was leaning forward over the table, hands open, voice low and certain, and the men around him were leaning in with him, drawn by the gravity of the story. Travis had his forearms on the table and his eyes on Brandon's face with the focused attention of someone receiving instruction. She looked at the cap on Brandon's head. She picked up her phone and sent a text to Dennis. The message said only, "I need to tell you something. Not tonight. Tomorrow before you open." Dennis read it from behind the bar, his expression unchanged, and sent back a single word. Okay. He did not look toward Brandon's table. He went back to wiping the bar and did not look anywhere in particular, which was its own kind of answer. The following Thursday, the room arranged itself the way rooms arrange themselves when something unspoken is approaching, which is to say nothing changed in any visible way and everything was different. George Monroe was at his window table. Pamela was at her post table. Dennis was behind the bar. Walter was in his corner with his newspaper and his Pilsner, and the newspaper had not been turned past the front page in 45 minutes. Brandon arrived with his group at 5:10 and reconfigured the furniture near the center of the room with the easy authority of a man who has stopped asking permission. He pulled 2 tables together and settled into the chair that put his back to the room and his face toward the bar, which was either instinct or habit or performance. He ordered a round before he had fully sat down. The story that night was about the Korangal Valley in a summer that he placed in 2010. He gave it the full treatment. The heat, the dust, the specific sound an RPG makes when it passes close enough that you feel it before you hear it. He gave the men names, ranks, personal details. He described a younger Marine who sang old country songs under his breath during a long observation post, said it was the strangest and most comforting sound he had ever heard at 3 in the morning on a hillside in Afghanistan. He delivered this with the timing of a man who understood that the human detail, the small and unexpected one, was what made the larger story feel true. Earl Gallagher made a sound that was the involuntary sound of a man who has just seen something and cannot quite say what. Travis said nothing. He was watching Brandon's hands. Brandon shifted then, the way a current shifts when it approaches shallow water, and the tone moved from narrative into something more declarative. He said that he had the deepest respect for the men who had come before, said it with his eyes moving across the room to include the older veterans at their separate tables. Said it in a way that was shaped like respect and did not feel like it. He said the difference between then and now was not courage. He said courage was a constant. He said the difference was methodology was doctrine, was the precision of a scalpel compared to the blunt force of a hammer. He said the men of his generation had been trained to operate at a level of tactical sophistication that previous eras simply had not possessed. George Monroe set his glass down. He set it down slowly, with the deliberate absence of force that is its own kind of force. He did not slam it, and he did not place it gently. He set it down the way a man sets down something when he has made a decision about what comes next. He said without raising his voice, without looking across the room, "I've been listening to you for a while now." Brandon turned toward him. His expression shifted into the performance of patience, the look of a man about to explain something to someone who has almost understood. George said, "I was in Hugh City, February of '68. You know what Hugh City looked like in February of '68? Brandon started to say something. George did not let him. He said it looked like every building was trying to kill you. Every doorway, every window, every alley. The enemy had been in that city for weeks before we got there, and they knew every inch of it, and we knew nothing. We didn't have satellite imagery. We didn't have drone feeds. We had a rifle, a radio that worked when it wanted to, and the man next to us." He paused. He said, "I left my knee on a street in Hugh City. A piece of shrapnel about the size of my thumb took it off me on the 4th day. I crawled back to the line on my hands and one leg because the man who would have carried me was already dead. And I'm sitting here telling you that the men who were with me that day were not sledgehammers. They were the most precise, incapable, and remarkable people I have ever known. And I will not sit in this room and hear them described as less." The room was quiet the way a room gets quiet when it has stopped being a room and becomes something else. Brandon looked at George with the steady gaze of a man recalibrating. He opened his mouth and began a sentence about context, about historical framing, about the evolution of military doctrine. He did not finish the sentence. Walter Briggs stood up. He did not stand up quickly. He planted both hands on the table and pushed himself upright with the measured effort of a man whose body required negotiation in the mornings and compromise in the evenings, and who had made his peace with both. He was not a large man. He had not been a large man even when he was young. But when he stood, something happened in the room that had nothing to do with size. He moved across the floor without hurry, past the dartboard with its out-of-order sign, past the television with its silent football, past the bar where Dennis had gone completely still. He walked to George Monroe's table, and he pulled out the empty chair and he sat down in it. He did not say anything. He did not look at Brandon. He just sat there next to his friend with his hands folded on the table, and the weight of that sitting, the sheer unelaborated fact of it, pressed down on the room like weather. Brandon looked at the two old men for a moment. Then he looked at his group. Then he did what people do when they need to believe they still control the situation, which is to start talking again. He pivoted to the football game and asked Cody if he had seen the score, and Cody said he had not, and someone else said they had a good receiver this year, and the conversation folded back into itself and continued. But something had changed. Even Cody could feel it, and Cody had not been paying close attention to anything except his beer. Dennis moved down the bar and set a fresh Pilsner on the counter without looking at Walter. Then he set a short glass of Evan Williams bourbon next to it for George, which George had not asked for, and which Dennis would not charge him for. An hour passed. The group around Brandon cycled through two more stories, neither of which landed with the weight of the earlier ones. The room's attention had redistributed itself in some way that was hard to name, but impossible to reverse. Travis sat through it with his beer warming in his hand and his eyes moving periodically to the two men at the window table. Eventually, Brandon stood and stretched and said he was going to refresh his drink, and he walked to the bar, and on the way back he stopped. He stopped at Walter's table, not at the table near the window where Walter had moved. Walter had returned to his corner table sometime in the previous half hour quietly without announcement, as though he had simply relocated himself between one moment and the next. He was sitting with his newspaper again, the same front page, and his glass of beer that was down to the last quarter. Brandon set one hand on the back of the empty chair across from Walter. Walter looked up. His eyes were a pale blue that in low light looked almost gray, and they met Brandon's with the complete neutrality of a man who had no particular investment in what came next. Brandon asked if he could sit for a minute. Walter said nothing. After a moment, he tilted his head toward the chair. Brandon sat. He said, "Walter Wright." "Dennis mentioned your name." Walter said, "Briggs." Brandon said, "Brandon Holden." He offered his hand. Walter took it one brief shake and released it. Brandon put his hand back around his glass. He asked what branch. Walter said, "Marines." Brandon's eyes moved to the old man's jacket collar and back. He said, "Semper Fi." "What years?" Walter said, "Long time ago." Brandon smiled the easy, warm smile. He said, "Vietnam." Walter didn't answer immediately. He looked at the bar, then back at his glass, and there was something in the angle of his head that was not evasion, but was something older and more settled than that. He said, "Long time ago." His voice was dry, not from age alone, but from something structural, like a man who had economized on words for so long that the voice had shaped itself accordingly. Brandon nodded with the performance of understanding. He began to talk about his own service, the modest version, the one calibrated for an unfamiliar room. He mentioned Canar with the ease of a man dropping a key onto a table, not presenting it, just placing it where it could be seen. He mentioned night movement. He mentioned close quarters work. He mentioned the particular loneliness of reconnaissance, all of it shaped into a form designed to invite recognition. Walter listened, or appeared to listen. His face offered nothing. That was what Brandon would think about later if he thought about it at all. Not the absence of admiration, which he could work around, but the complete absence of reaction, which was something different. You could not fill an absence. You could only sit in it. He said, "I imagine a lot of what you went through was different from what we were dealing with. Different era, different tech. Must have been tough without the advantages we had." He said it with the smile still on, the voice calibrated to respect. Walter looked at him then. Actually looked at him the way he had not quite done before, a direct and unhurried examination that lasted exactly as long as it needed to and stopped before it became confrontational. He said, "People who know how to stay quiet, those are the ones who usually have something real to say." Brandon considered this for a moment, trying to determine which direction it was pointing. Then Walter reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced his wallet. It was old leather, dark and worn smooth at the edges. He opened it, and from the innermost fold he drew out a photograph. Black and white, folded in half, the paper yellowed and soft at the creases. He unfolded it and set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it, not at Brandon, at the photograph. From where Brandon sat, he could see part of the image. Two men standing beside some kind of equipment jungle, behind them a sky that was very white from overexposure. One of the figures was blurry at the edges, the way figures get in old photographs when they had been moving. The other was sharp and still facing slightly away from the camera. Brandon's gaze went to the photograph, and something moved through his face quickly, the way a shadow moves when a cloud crosses the sun. It was not guilt. It was not recognition. It was something quieter and more fundamental, the involuntary acknowledgement of a man who has spent years constructing a version of himself and has just sat down across from the original of something he has only ever copied. Then the smile came back, easy and complete, warm at the edges, reaching all the way up into his eyes with the practiced fluency of 17 years. He started to say something about the photo. Walter folded it closed, put it back in the wallet, put the wallet back in his pocket, picked up his glass and drank the last of his beer in one slow, unhurried swallow. And then he looked at Brandon Holden with those pale gray-blue eyes that had looked at things that this man would never see, and he did not say anything at all. And the silence was not hostile and not cold, but simply final, the way the closing of a door is final. And it said everything that Walter had decided this particular moment deserved. Brandon held the look for 3 full seconds. Then he pushed back from the table and stood up and said it had been good to talk, and he would see him next time. Walter nodded once. Brandon crossed the room back to his table, reclaimed his chair, said something to Cody that made Cody laugh, and the evening continued. But he did not look back at the corner table for the rest of the night, and that careful absence of looking was its own kind of answer. Dennis Keller behind the bar had watched the whole exchange without appearing to watch it. He had a gift for this. He waited until Brandon's attention was fully committed to his own group, and then he let his eyes rest on Walter's corner for just a moment. Walter had put his newspaper away. He was sitting with both hands flat on the table looking at nothing in particular, and he looked like a man who had just finished a task he had not wanted to start. George Monroe from his table by the window saw it too. He said nothing. He picked up the small bourbon that Dennis had poured for him and drank a careful sip and set it back down and let the evening go on around him. This man who had lost his knee in a street in Hugh City and who had never once felt the need to describe the sound it made. The door opened twice in the next half hour, letting in cold air, and two strangers who looked around decided this was not what they were looking for and left. The football game ran through its fourth quarter on the silent television. Somebody's phone buzzed against a tabletop. Travis Weaver sat in his chair and stared at the label on his beer bottle and felt something shifting in the floor beneath him. Something slow and structural, the way you feel the ground move before you understand what is moving. He was not yet sure what it meant, but he had been in enough situations to know the feeling of a thing about to change, and this was that feeling, and it did not go away. 3 weeks before the night everything changed, Travis Weaver started keeping a list. He did not write it down. He kept it in the part of his head that had once been used for tracking patrol routes and memorizing the faces of men he needed to recognize in the dark, the part that apparently did not stop working just because the war had. He kept it the way you keep things you are not yet ready to call what they are. The first item on the list was the captain who changed ranks. Brandon had mentioned his commanding officer 4 separate times across 4 different stories, and the man's rank had been different each time. Not dramatically different, not enough to trigger an immediate alarm, but different. The way small structural errors are different from surface errors. A surface error was a mistake. A structural error was a sign that the structure itself had been built wrong, that the details were being invented in the moment rather than remembered from a fixed truth. The second item was a date that did not line up. The third was a geographic detail about Kunar province that Travis had no specific knowledge to contradict, but that scraped against something in the back of his mind, some half-remembered briefing or conversation or late-night talk with another soldier, the kind of thing you absorbed without cataloging and could not retrieve on command, but could not entirely dismiss either. He sat with these items in the list and told himself he might be wrong, told himself that combat memory was notoriously unreliable, that he himself had misremembered dates and names in the order of events, that this was the nature of it, that you did not get to keep everything in sequence and everything accurate, that the brain made choices under pressure about what to hold on to, and the choices were not always the right ones. He told himself this on Tuesday. He told himself this again on Thursday. On the second Thursday of October, he stopped telling himself. It was not a single thing. It was the accumulation of the items on the list, reaching a weight that his willingness to explain them away could no longer support. Brandon was in the middle of a story about a resupply run that had gone wrong outside a firebase in Kunar, and he was describing the firebase's location with the casual specificity of a man reporting a fact, and something in the description was wrong, in a way Travis could not immediately name, but also could not ignore a wrongness that sat in the geography, the way a crack sits in a wall, visible once you have seen it and impossible to unsee. He set his beer down on the table. He did not say anything. He picked up the beer again and finished it and set the glass down and sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the table and thought about the 37 months he had spent trusting people based on the information they gave him and what it had cost him when that information turned out to be wrong and what it had cost the men next to him. Brandon finished the story. Marcus made an appreciative sound. Cody said something about the craziness of war. Travis said nothing. Brandon noticed. He had an instinct for shifts in the room for the redistribution of attention, and he noticed Travis's silence the way a conductor notices a musician who has stopped playing. He looked at Travis with the assessing look, the one beneath the easy warmth, and then he pivoted the way he always pivoted forward into the next story, the next installment, the escalation that had been arriving by degrees across 3 months, and that tonight was going to arrive all at once. He had been watching the two men at their separate tables all evening. George Monroe with his navy blazer and his careful bourbon. Walter Briggs in the corner with his newspaper, and his single glass of Pilsner that he nursed for 2 hours with the patience of a man who understood the value of making a thing last. He had watched them with the particular attention he gave to things that had not yet yielded to him, and tonight he had decided to stop approaching them indirectly. Tonight he was going to bring the room to him. He started talking about doctrine, about the evolution of reconnaissance operations from the mid-century forward, speaking with the authority of someone who had studied the subject and had mistaken study for experience, which was an error that looked like knowledge until you placed it next to the real thing. He said the men who had fought in previous eras had been products of their time, capable and brave within the limitations of what they had been given, but limited nonetheless by doctrine that was blunt, where modern doctrine was precise, reactive where modern doctrine was anticipatory. George Monroe turned his head and looked at him. Brandon did not stop. He was committed now the way a vehicle is committed once it has left the road, still moving, trajectory locked. He said that the fundamental difference between then and now was not a matter of courage, but of architecture, of the structural sophistication with which modern units approach problems that previous generations had solved with numbers and endurance rather than precision and intelligence. He gestured toward the photographs on the wall, the men in the Huey, the squad photograph from somewhere that no one had ever identified. He said all respect to them, complete and genuine respect, but they were working with tools that belong in a museum. The room had gone very quiet. Pamela Dixon put her phone face down on the table. She had been waiting for the right moment for 3 weeks since the morning she had met Dennis at the bar before opening and told him what she knew about the northwest approach to the Korengal, about the route that had been closed before any operation ran through it in the spring of 2009. Dennis had listened without interrupting, and at the end he had said, "Let it sit a little longer." She had understood. There was a way these things had to happen, a sequence that the room needed to move through on its own before an outside hand could apply pressure without breaking something. But the room had moved through its sequence now. Brandon was still talking, and every word he said was landing on the older men in the room like something delivered with contempt dressed up as analysis. And Pamela Dixon had spent 4 years of her life in a country where contempt dressed as analysis got people killed, and she was done letting it sit. She said his name. Not loudly, not aggressively. She said it the way you say a name when you want to establish that what follows is directed and specific and not the opening of a debate. Brandon turned to her with the smile already adjusted to accommodate a female voice. The smile that said he was prepared to be patient. She said, "You mentioned the Korengal approach from the northwest. The ridge line you described coming down from the north face in spring." He said, "That's right." She said, "I was in that area. Spring of 2009, Forward Operating Base, Bostic, Logistics, and Combat Support. I worked the planning table for every operation that touched the Korengal corridor that season." Brandon held the smile. She said, "No unit crossed that ridgeline from the north in the spring of 2009. The approach was taken off every operational plan in February after EOD confirmed the northern goat paths had been seeded end to end. Nothing went through that approach until the following year. The table had gone silent in a way that was different from the silences earlier in the evening. This was not the silence of a room being entertained. This was the silence of a room paying close attention to something that mattered. Brandon said combat memory isn't always precise about routes. Pamela said, "I'm not talking about combat memory. I'm talking about the planning documents I helped produce. The approach you described was physically off the table. No one went through it." He said there were operations that didn't go through official channels. She said, "I know what those operations look like too. The support requirements still came across my desk." Something shifted in Brandon's face. Not dramatically, not in a way that Cody or Marcus would have caught. But Dennis caught it from behind the bar, and George Monroe caught it from his table, and Walter Briggs, sitting in the corner with his newspaper folded in his lap, went very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Brandon turned the shift into a different kind of energy. He was good at this. He had been doing it his whole life, converting one thing into another thing faster than the room could track, and he had been doing it for long enough that it was nearly seamless. He drew breath and changed his posture, and when he spoke again, his voice had the particular texture of a man who has decided that the best response to being questioned is to become larger. He said that he understood why someone in a support role might not have visibility into every operation that ran through a given corridor. He said it with the careful diplomacy of a man making a distinction that was designed to sound respectful and to land like a verdict. Pamela looked at him. She said, "I didn't say I had visibility into every operation. I said I knew the terrain. And the terrain you described doesn't match the approach you're claiming. Brandon looked around the room. He was reading it the way he always read it, the constant calculation. He saw Pamela, who had the quiet certainty of someone who had been here before and was not going to be moved. He saw Dennis, who had not moved from his spot behind the bar and whose expression had shifted into something that was not quite neutral anymore. He saw George Monroe, who was watching him with the patient attention of a man who has all evening and no particular anxiety about how it ends. And he saw Walter Briggs. Walter had not looked up from the table. He was sitting with his hands folded in his lap, the newspaper folded beside his glass, and his posture had not changed, and his expression had not changed. And he had said nothing and done nothing since Brandon had begun the evening's performance, and Brandon had been watching him long enough to understand that this stillness was not absence. It was accumulation. Brandon Holden made a decision. He made it the way people make decisions that they will later describe as instinct, when what they really mean is that they had been moving toward it for longer than they realized, and the final step arrived before they had fully thought through where it was going to land. He picked up his beer. He walked across the room. He stopped in front of Walter's corner table. Walter looked up. Brandon said, "I know you've been sitting over here listening all night." Walter waited. Brandon said, "And I appreciate that. I do. The older generation, the men who built the foundation, I have nothing but respect. But you'd have to admit that what we were dealing with, what my generation was dealing with in the mountains over there, that's a different world from what your era saw. No offense, just reality." Walter did not say anything. Brandon took one more step, and his voice dropped into the register that he used when he wanted to sound like he was being honest at personal cost. The register that said, "I am telling you this because I respect you enough to tell you the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." He said you wouldn't know anything about it. What we were doing. The recon work, the real stuff. That's not a criticism. It's just a different era, different world. He said it and let it sit and waited for the response that would tell him what he had. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone present understands simultaneously that something has just been done that cannot be undone. Frank Donovan, a Gulf War Marine who had been sitting at the end of the bar for the better part of the evening, put his glass down on the counter. He did not say anything. He just put the glass down with a firmness that was addressed to no one and everyone. Dennis Keller stopped moving entirely. George Monroe looked at the table in front of him. And Walter Briggs sat with Brandon's words settling around him like sediment settling to the bottom of still water, slow and inevitable, and finally at rest. He was not angry. This was the thing that would have surprised anyone watching who expected the old man to bristle, to stiffen, to fire back. He was not angry. He was something quieter and more complete, a man who has just had confirmed something he had understood for some time, and the confirmation arrives not as a wound, but as a kind of finality. He looked at Brandon Holden standing over him, and he saw the cap with its silver thread emblem, and he saw the cargo pants that had not been broken in by anything harder than a sidewalk, and he saw the practiced warmth in the eyes that did not go all the way down, and he saw beneath all of it a man who was afraid of something he could not name and had built the whole elaborate construction to stand between himself and the fear. He had known this kind of man before. The names changed, the era changed, the fear was always the same. He thought about Russell. He had thought about Russell 1,000 times over 60 years, and he had never said the name out loud in this building, or any other building, had never told anyone about the 3 hours in the mud, or the arithmetic of 30 yards, or the way the man had died 3 days later in a field hospital outside Hugh, while Walter was 17 miles away doing something he could not talk about then and had never talked about since. He thought about what Russell's face had looked like in the half-dark of that jungle night, turned sideways in the mud, one eye pressed into the earth and one eye open toward a sky he could not see. He thought about what it meant to carry something like that and to sit in a room with someone who wore borrowed credentials and called it the same thing. And then something else moved through him, something that arrived from a different direction, and he looked away from Brandon and across the room to where Travis Weaver was sitting. Travis had not moved. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table now, and he was looking at Brandon, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has been adding things up for a long time and has finally arrived at the total and does not like the number. It was the look of a young man who is standing at the edge of something difficult and has decided to step forward anyway. Walter recognized that look. He had worn it himself once, a long time ago in a room nothing like this one. Something loosened in his chest. quietly without ceremony like a knot worked loose by water. He felt it, noted it, and let it be what it was. The next generation. Still there. Still capable of the step. He looked back down at the table and said nothing, and waited. Travis Weaver stood up. He stood slowly, pushing back from the table without scraping it, and when he was on his feet, the room turned toward him, the way a room turns toward the unexpected. The collective attention swinging like a compass needle finding north. Every person at Brandon's tables assumed they knew what was coming. They had seen Travis be the most consistent presence in Brandon's orbit for 3 months. They had seen him listen, lean, and absorb. They had seen him defer. Brandon himself looked at Travis with the slight relaxation of a man receiving expected reinforcement, his shoulders settling by a fraction, his chin lifting. Travis looked at Brandon for a long moment. Then he said, "I was in the Korengal." His voice was flat and clean, the voice of a man giving a report. He said 2010, 7 months, 101st Airborne Charlie Company as a private first class working my way to specialist. We were in that valley for 7 months, and I talked to every unit that moved through our area of operations. Brandon was still holding the slight relaxation in his posture, still processing. Travis said Force Recon came through twice. Small groups, we knew who they were. That community is small and people talk, and you remember the faces and the names because they were the ones going into places we weren't going into. He paused. He said, "I don't remember you." The 2 words at the end of that sentence took everything before them and made them into a verdict. Brandon's posture changed. The relaxation inverted became its opposite, became the specific rigidity of a man absorbing something he has no prepared response for. He said 7 months isn't a full rotation. The units wouldn't have overlapped exactly. Travis said, "I know the rotations. I know the timeline. I know who was operating in that corridor in 2010 well enough to know who wasn't." He said it without heat, without triumph. He said it the way you state a fact when the fact has cost you something personally, and you are therefore past the point of embellishment. He looked across the room at Walter Briggs. Walter was looking back at him. There was nothing theatrical in the exchange. No signal passed between them, no acknowledgement that could be read by anyone watching. It was simply 2 people looking at each other across a room, one of them old and one of them young. And in the space between them, something was understood that neither of them would have been able to put into words, but that both of them felt with the precision of a tuning fork struck against something that matches its frequency. Travis looked back at Brandon. He said, "I listened to you for 3 months. I thought you understood what I went through because you'd been through something similar. I was wrong about that." He sat back down, picked up his beer, looked at the table. Earl Gallagher was staring at the floor. Cody had his hands around his glass and was not looking at anything. Marcus had shifted in his chair so that his body was half turned away from Brandon, the involuntary geometry of dissociation. Brandon stood in the middle of the room with 3 months of careful construction coming apart around him, and the thing that was visible on his face in that moment was not the thing most people would have expected. It was not rage, it was not calculation. For the length of one unguarded second before the machinery reassembled itself, it was something close to the look of a man who has been running for a long time and has just realized he does not know what he was running from, or whether running has done anything except extend the distance between himself and something he should have faced. Then the machinery came back. He turned toward Walter Briggs. He had decided in that fraction of a second on a last move, not a retreat, an attack. Because retreat was the thing he had never learned to do without it feeling like annihilation. An attack was what he had built himself around for longer than he could account for. And even now, even at the edge of the worst night he had constructed for himself, the habit was stronger than the wisdom. He walked to Walter's corner table. He did not sit down this time. He stood over it, over the old man in the worn tweed jacket, and he put both hands on the surface of the table and leaned forward and said, "Here is what I want to know. I want to know what you actually did. Not what it says on some form somewhere. What you actually did. Because you've been sitting in this corner for however many years, watching everyone else, and never saying a word. And I'd like to know what that's worth. I'd like to know what you're carrying that makes your silence worth more than everyone else's words." He said it and meant it to be sharp, and it was sharp, and it landed exactly where he aimed it. Walter Briggs looked up at him from the corner table. The pale blue eyes, the dry, weathered face, the hands with their gnarled knuckles resting on the worn wood completely still. He did not say, "I was in Vietnam." He did not say, "I wrote the doctrine your cap is named for." He did not say, I know what I carried, and I know what you don't, and the distance between those two things is the whole of what you are afraid to measure. He said, you said you were in the Korengal. Brandon straightened slightly. Said, that's right. Walter said, 18 months. Brandon said, that's right. Walter reached over and picked up his glass. He did not drink from it. He held it the way you hold something when you need your hands to be occupied while your mind is working through something with great precision. He set the glass back down. He looked at Brandon Holden with the complete attention of a man who has very little left to prove and has therefore developed the rarest of all luxuries, which is the freedom to simply observe. He said, observation post kilo. Paktika province. Brandon said nothing. Walter said there was a dog. The room contracted. Every person in it felt it, the sudden drop in the atmospheric pressure of the space, the sense that the air had become denser without moving. Walter said a stray. Female. Gray and white, one ear up and one down. Second platoon found her in the spring and kept her. Everyone on that hill knew her name. He looked at Brandon. He said, what was her name? The silence that followed was not like the silences earlier in the evening. The earlier silences had been pauses in a conversation, the natural spaces between words where breath is gathered and thought is organized. This silence was different. This silence was the space where something should have been and was not a structural absence, the silence of a question that has exposed a room where the answer should have been living and has found it empty. Brandon did not move. 1 second, 2 seconds. His mouth opened. He said there were dogs all over that country. 4 seconds. He said you can't expect anyone to remember every. 7 seconds. He said, that's not. The sentence did not finish. 9 seconds. 11 seconds. The tick of the ceiling fan above them was audible. The low sound of the football game from the muted television. Somewhere outside, a car passed on Millbrook with its radio on the music muffled and indistinct there and gone. 12 seconds of silence. Brandon Holden stood at Walter's table and could not answer a question about a dog. Every person in that room understood what that meant. Not because they knew the answer, because they understood with the instinct of people who had served or who had sat in rooms with people who had served, that there was a category of detail that existed only for people who had actually been in a place. The minor and unguarded details. The stray dog with the mismatched ears. The particular name given to her by a group of men who were very far from home and who needed something small and ordinary to carry for a little while. The kind of detail that no book contained, that no interview produced, that lived only in the bodies of people who had been there and would stay there until they were gone. Brandon knew none of it. The room knew that he knew none of it. He straightened up from the table. He opened his mouth once more and began to form words that did not come. And then the door opened. The heavy oak door of VFW Post 724, which had been opening and closing for 70 years, and which had developed over those decades a particular authority of sound, a weight and a resonance that was different from ordinary doors, opened with a draft of cold October air that moved through the room like a held breath finally released. 2 men came through first. They wore army dress uniforms, the Class A, the dark green of formal occasions and official visits. Their shoulder boards precise, their cover straight. They were in their 30s, faces neutral and composed in the specific way of people whose job is to be present without becoming part of the situation. Behind them, a third man. He was not in uniform. He wore a dark suit, charcoal gray, and he wore it the way certain men wear suits, which is as though the suit is incidental to the person inside it, a formality acknowledged and then set aside. He was 67 years old, and he had silver hair cut close and a face that had been organized by decades into something that was not exactly hard and not exactly kind, but was entirely certain the face of a man who had long ago made his peace with the weight of the decisions that had come to him and had carried that weight until it became simply part of his structure. He was broad through the shoulders. He moved without hurry. His eyes, when he came through the door, did what they did in every room he entered, which was to read it completely and immediately, a sweep so practiced it was nearly invisible. Corner to corner, near to far, threat to no threat, known to unknown. The sweep stopped. It stopped at the corner table, at the worn tweed jacket, at the pale blue eyes that had just asked a question that a man could not answer. Henderson, the post commander, was already moving toward the door. his voice running ahead of him with the anxious velocity of a man who has been surprised by something he should have anticipated. He said a name, General Steele. He said something about not expecting, about an honor about. The man in the gray suit did not look at Henderson. He was already walking. Past the bar where Dennis Keller had gone completely still. Past the table where George Monroe was sitting with both hands around his glass, looking down at the surface of the table with an expression that was not surprise and not relief, but the particular quiet of a man who has been waiting a long time for something to be true that he already knew was true. Past Brandon Holden, who had not moved from the spot beside Walter's table, who stood there now with the cap in his hand and the full exposure of the moment settling over him like weather. The man in the gray suit walked to the corner table. He stopped in front of it. He stopped in front of Walter Briggs, 82 years old, in his worn jacket with his folded newspaper and his glass of beer, sitting in the corner of a room in Harlan, Kentucky on a Thursday evening in October. And the man in the suit drew himself up to his full height and put his heels together and raised his right hand to the level of his brow in a salute that was exact and unhurried and complete. He held it. The room stopped breathing. He said in a voice that carried the weight of every order he had ever given and every weight he had ever borne, without putting it down, Sergeant Major Briggs. "It is an honor to see you again, sir." The salute held for 3 full seconds before Walter Briggs raised his own right hand. The gesture was imperfect in the way that 82 years makes all gestures imperfect. The knuckles too swollen for the crispness. The movement had once possessed the shoulder, not carrying it quite to the height it would have reached in 1968 or 1975, or any of the years in between. But the angle was correct. The intention was exact. And in the room where it happened, among the people watching it happen, the imperfection made it more rather than less, the way a scar makes the skin it inhabits more real than skin that has never been tested. Walter lowered his hand. He said Marcus. His voice was the same dry, economical rasp it always was, but warmer, the warmth of a man who does not deploy it often and means it completely when he does. He said it has been a long time. Raymond Steele lowered his salute. He said too long, sir. He said it without performance, without the cadences of ceremony. He said it as a fact with the particular weight of a man acknowledging a debt that has been accumulating for 40 years. Brandon Holden was standing 3 feet from this exchange. He had not moved since the door opened. He stood with the Marine Force reconnaissance cap in his right hand and his left hand open at his side, and his face had undergone the kind of change that faces undergo when the architecture beneath them gives way. Not a collapse exactly, not a visible crumbling, but a loss of the internal pressure that had been holding everything in its practiced position. The warmth was gone from his eyes. The easy confidence that had occupied his posture for 3 months had evacuated without announcement, leaving behind something smaller and uncertain that he did not know how to arrange into anything presentable. He was looking at the man in the gray suit and at the 82-year-old man in the corner, and at the distance between his own understanding of the room and what the room had just become, and the distance was very large and he had no map for it. Steele did not look at him yet. He pulled out the chair across from Walter, the same chair where Brandon had sat 3 weeks ago, with his easy borrowed authority, and he sat down in it with the careful respect of a man choosing his position deliberately, as though the chair itself required something from him. One of his aides moved to stand near the door. The other settled at the bar 3 stools away from anyone, and Dennis set a glass of water in front of him without being asked. Henderson was still attempting to insert himself into the event, orbiting at a distance of about 6 feet, his voice running through half sentences about an honor and a surprise, and whether the general would like. Steele raised one hand from the table, a minimal gesture, 2 inches of movement that contained an entire grammar of command, and Henderson stopped talking and did not start again. Steele looked at Walter. He said, "I'm in town for the memorial dedication tomorrow morning. When I found out you were sometimes here on Thursdays, I had to take the chance. Walter said you drove out of your way. Steele said I drove 50 miles out of my way." He paused, and something moved through his face that had nothing to do with the formal register of the conversation. He said it was not far enough. The room was still not breathing normally. The people in it were doing the thing that people do when they have witnessed something they do not fully understand, but can feel the weight of which is to be very quiet and very present, and to try not to disturb the air any more than necessary. Earl Gallagher had his hands flat on his thighs. Cody was looking at the table. Marcus had turned his chair completely and was facing the corner with an expression of open, uncomplicated reverence that was perhaps the most honest thing he had worn all evening. Travis Weaver stood at the edge of his table and watched General Raymond Steele sit across from Walter Briggs and felt something shifting in the ground beneath him that was not the disorientation of earlier in the night, but its opposite, a settling, a foundation revealing itself beneath the surface. George Monroe sat at his window table and did not look at either man. He looked out the window at the parking lot and the maple tree and the dead branch that was still hanging by whatever thread of bark had been holding it for 2 seasons now. He had a small smile on his face that was not for anyone in the room, but was simply there, the expression of a man who has arrived at the end of a story he has been reading for a very long time and has found that it ended the way it should. Steele turned to address the room. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He simply shifted his body in the chair slightly and looked at the people in the room with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who has given speeches in front of senators and joint chiefs and who has understood for years that the most important audiences are never the largest ones. He said, "Most of you don't know who this man is." He meant it as a statement of fact, not a rebuke. He let it stand for a moment before he continued. He said Walter Briggs served in the Marine Corps from 1961 to 1985. He did not serve in force reconnaissance. He was among the small group of men who created it, who built the operational doctrine from the ground up in the early 1960s when the concept was still being argued over in conference rooms at Quantico. The training protocols, the insertion methodology, the after-action frameworks that every force recon unit still uses. His work is in all of it. He paused. He said he did 4 tours. He spent more time behind enemy lines than most men spend deployed in their entire careers. He was wounded 3 times and reported none of them until the wounds were severe enough that he could no longer conceal them from the corpsmen. He carried men out of places that were not survivable more than once, and he never mentioned any of their names in any document that was not classified because he did not believe that carrying a man out of a bad place was something that required documentation. Dennis Keller put both hands on the bar and looked at them. Steele said in the spring of 1983, "I was a 25-year-old officer on a classified operation in Lebanon. I will not describe the details of that operation even now. What I will say is that I made a decision that was wrong in the way that young officers' decisions are sometimes wrong, which is confidently and completely. Walter Briggs, who was 40 years old and who had seen everything I had not yet seen, spent the better part of a night correcting my error. He did so at a cost that I did not fully understand at the time because he did not tell me about it until 3 days later when I noticed that he was moving with a care that he had not been moving with before." Steele stopped. The room waited. He said he had taken 2 rounds in the process of doing what he did. He had not mentioned it. He had not slowed down. He had simply done what needed doing and then continued. He looked at Walter. Walter was looking at the table. Steele said I asked him afterward why he had not told me. He said that the mission was not finished yet and that he did not see the value in providing information that would complicate the decision-making of the people who needed to make decisions. That was the complete answer. That was all he offered. He let that settle into the room and stay there. Then he turned, and for the first time since entering the building, he looked directly at Brandon Holden. Brandon had not moved. He was still standing in the same position, cap in hand, and the thing that was visible in his face now was something that went beyond the dismantlement of the evening's performance. It was the look of a man standing in a room where the actual dimensions of something have just been revealed to him for the first time, and the actual dimensions are so much larger than the space he had been occupying that the contrast is itself a kind of answer to questions he had never been willing to ask. Steele said the emblem on that cap belongs to men who earned it. It belongs to the men who built what it represents and the men who carried what it means into places where it cost them something real. It does not belong to performance. It does not belong to stories. And it does not belong to someone who cannot answer a simple question about where he claims to have stood. He said it without cruelty. He said it with the clean finality of a man stating a boundary that has existed for a long time and has simply not been stated aloud until now. He said, "Take it off." The 2 words landed in the room like something structural. Not a request and not a suggestion, and not the kind of command that allows for the negotiation of tone, the kind that expects obedience not because of rank, but because of what is true. Brandon Holden stood in the silence that followed and looked at the cap in his hand. He stood there for 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds, something happened in his face that was almost private, Almost the kind of thing a person should not have to do in a room full of people looking at them. The dissolution of a version of yourself that you have been maintaining for long enough that you have forgotten it is a version rather than the thing itself. His jaw moved. His eyes moved to Walter briefly, then to the floor. He did not say anything. He turned and walked toward the door. Not quickly, not the flight of a man panicking, but with the particular diminished walk of someone who has been reduced to exactly their actual size and is discovering for the first time that the actual size is smaller than they had thought and that there is nothing left to fill the extra space. The door opened. The cold came in for a moment. The door closed. The cap was not on his head when he left. He was still holding it in his right hand, and he carried it out with him into the October night, and the room did not see him again. For a moment after the door closed, no one spoke. Then Dennis Keller came out from behind the bar. He came out from behind it with the deliberate movement of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment and has recognized that the moment is now. He was not looking at Walter. He was not looking at Steele. He was looking at Henderson, who was standing near the post commander's desk at the side of the room, and the look on Dennis's face was the look of a man who has been patient with something that did not deserve his patience and has finished being patient. He crossed the room until he was standing in front of Henderson, and he said quietly enough that only the nearest tables could hear. "You knew." Henderson started to say something. "Dennis said the second week he was here you pulled his membership card, and you saw the same thing. I saw when I pulled it, which was an address that went back less than 60 days, and a membership application that had 3 blanks where the service record information should have been. You saw that and you let it sit because he was bringing in new members and filling up Thursday evenings and making the numbers look better at the end of the month." Henderson said, "Dennis, that's not." Dennis said, "I let it sit too. I'm not standing here saying I handled it right. I'm standing here saying you knew before I knew, and you had more authority to do something about it than I did, and you didn't do it, and that matters in a place like this one, because this is the kind of place where it matters." The two men stood facing each other in the middle of the room. Henderson was 51 years old, and he had served 4 years in the Navy in the early 90s, and he had never been in combat, and he knew it, and Dennis knew it, and in this moment in this room with this specific weight pressing down on the air between them, that history arranged itself into a shape that neither of them had asked for, but both of them were standing inside. Henderson said, "You're right." He said it without deflection. He said it looking at Dennis and not away from him. He said, "I'm going to address it properly with the board. What happened tonight should have happened months ago, and it didn't happen because I was looking at the wrong things." He paused. He said, "I'm sorry, Dennis." Dennis looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man accepting something that will not undo what happened, but that is being offered honestly and deserves to be received that way. He turned and walked back to the bar and picked up his cloth and set it over his left shoulder and went back to work. The room began to breathe again. Not loudly, not in the way of a room that has released tension and returned to normal. In the way of a room that has been through something and is now moving carefully through the other side of it, carrying what it has learned. Frank Donovan went to Walter's table first. He stood there for a moment, this Gulf War Marine, with the thick forearms and the quiet eyes, and he held out his hand. Walter took it. They shook without words. Frank nodded once and went back to his stool at the bar. Then an older man named Paul, who had been sitting near the back wall and who had served in the late years of Vietnam as a Navy corpsman, came over and did the same thing. He held Walter's hand in both of his for a moment and said, "Thank you for your service, Sergeant Major." He said it like he meant each word individually. One by one, without anyone organizing it or announcing it, the people in the room moved through this small ceremony of acknowledgement. Not everyone. Not the ones who had been closest to Brandon Cody and Marcus and Earl, who were now sitting with the self-conscious stillness of people recalibrating their recent past. But the others, the regulars, the people who had been coming to this room for years and who had their own reasons for being here and their own things they carried, they came to the corner table and offered what they had to offer, which was the simple and powerful gesture of showing up. Walter received each of them the same way. A handshake, a nod, the pale blue eyes direct and present and free of the performance of emotion. He was not overcome. He was not diminished. He was exactly what he had always been, sitting in the corner of this room, and what had changed was not him, but the visibility of what had always been true. Steele watched this from across the table and said nothing. He had his own glass now, the Evan Williams that Dennis had set in front of him without being asked, and he held it with both hands and let the room do what the room needed to do. George Monroe came last. He crossed the room with the deliberate gait of his prosthetic knee, moving carefully between tables, and when he reached the corner, he did not extend his hand. He sat down in the chair beside Walter, the one that Walter had occupied many Tuesdays ago, when he had walked across the room to sit beside George in the middle of someone else's performance. And he sat there the same way Walter had sat then, without announcement, without explanation, simply present. They sat together for a while without speaking. Then George said very quietly, "I always knew you were something, Walter. I just didn't know the scale of it." Walter looked at him. He said, "You knew enough." He paused. He said, "You always knew enough. That was why you kept coming." George considered this. Then he made the small sound that served him as a laugh, not humor exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sound of a man who finds something true and recognizes it as true without needing to make more of it. He picked up the bourbon that Dennis had somehow placed at his new location and drank a careful sip. They sat there together, these two old men in the corner of the room that had been their corner for years, and the evening moved around them. Steele eventually rose to leave. He had a briefing early and the dedication in the morning, and the obligations of a man whose schedule was still not entirely his own, even in retirement. He shook hands with Dennis, who came around the bar for it, and said something quiet to him that Dennis received with a nod and a straight look. He spoke briefly with Pamela, who had remained at her table throughout everything, with the steady composure of someone who had done what needed doing and was now content to let the room process it, and whatever he said to her made her look down at the table for a moment before she looked back up with something in her face that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. He came back to Walter's table. He stood for a moment. He said, "I'll be here in the morning, before the ceremony, if you're willing." Walter looked at him. He said, "I'll be here." Steele said 8 o'clock. "I'll bring the coffee." He said goodnight to the room without ceremony, a simple general word that carried inside it a quality that not many people's goodnight carried. And then he and his aides moved through the door, and the night took them. Travis Weaver had not come to the corner table during the procession of handshakes. He had sat at his table and watched everything the full span of the evening, from his arrival to the current silence, and he was doing the thing he did when he was processing something important, which was to be very still and let it move through him without interference. He was thinking about 3 months of Thursday evenings. He was thinking about what he had wanted Brandon to be and why he had wanted it, and what that wanting said about the thing he was still trying to find his way through the long corridor aftermath of coming home from a war that did not stop being a war just because you had left it. He was thinking about the list he had been keeping in his head, the items that had accumulated past the weight his willingness to explain them could hold. And he was thinking about the moment he had stood up and said the thing he had stood up to say, and what it had cost him and what it had returned. He was thinking about the old man in the corner. George Monroe had gone home. The room had thinned to half its evening count. Dennis was doing the quiet work of closing, moving through the habitual choreography of a man who had done this 10,000 times and whose body knew the steps without instruction. Travis stood up. He carried his empty glass to the bar, first set it down and said goodnight to Dennis, who looked at him with the specific look he had given Travis since the moment Travis had stood up and spoken. Not approval exactly. Closer to recognition, the look of someone who has revised their assessment of a person upward and has not yet finished deciding what the new assessment means. Then Travis crossed the room to the corner table. Walter was still sitting. His beer was long finished, the glass empty, and pushed to one side. He was sitting with both hands on the table and his eyes somewhere in the middle distance, not absent but interior, the focused inwardness of a man going through something methodically. He looked up when Travis stopped beside the table. Travis said, "Can I sit for a minute?" Walter said, "Sit down." Travis sat. He put his hands around the empty glass he had brought out of habit, and then realized it was empty and set it aside and folded his hands on the table instead. He looked at Walter and then at the table and then at Walter again. He said, "I should have said something sooner." Walter said, "You said it when you were ready to say it." Travis said, "I let it go too long." Walter said, "You were working through something." He said it without judgment, as a description of a process rather than a verdict on the pace of it. He said, "You don't always know right away when something is wrong. Sometimes you have to let the wrong thing show you its whole shape before you can see it clearly." Travis was quiet for a moment. He said, "I needed someone to understand what it was like over there." He paused. He said I thought he understood it. Walter said, I know. He said it the way he said things simply and without elaboration. But in the two words there was a fullness that Travis felt rather than analyze the recognition of a man who has been inside the specific loneliness of coming home from a war and finding that the language for it does not exist in the places you have returned to. Travis looked at the table. Then he said, how did you do it? He was not asking about combat. He was not asking about the missions or the operations or the classified years behind enemy lines. He was asking about the years after. The long, ordinary years of carrying it quietly in rooms where no one knew what you carried. Walter considered the question. He said, you find the things that make it worth carrying. He paused. He said, not the things that take the weight away. There's nothing that takes the weight away, but the things that make the weight mean something. People mostly. The right kind of room. He looked at the empty beer glass on the table. He said, I came here for 17 years, and mostly I sat in the corner and didn't say much, and that was enough. Because the room knew what it was, and I knew what it was, and that was a kind of language that didn't need words. Travis was listening with the focused attention of a person receiving something they have been needing to hear without knowing they needed to hear it. He said, were you afraid? He said it quietly and directly, the kind of question that can only be asked when two people have moved past the social geography that usually surrounds it. Walter did not answer right away. He looked at the table for a long time, the way he had looked at the photograph in his wallet on 100 evenings in this room, the private inventory of a man who keeps careful accounts. Then he said every day. He let the words stand alone for a moment before he added to them. He said every single day. But the men next to me were more afraid than I was, and so I didn't have the right to show it. And after long enough, not showing it becomes something you can use, not to hide from the fear, to walk next to it without being stopped by it. Travis looked at him. Walter said, you're going to be all right. He said it with the certainty of a man who has read a situation for many decades and who has learned to distinguish between the people who are going to make it through their specific difficulty and the people who are not. He said it as a fact, not a comfort, and that was exactly why it worked as both. Travis said nothing for a moment. Then he said, how do you know? Walter said, because you stood up. He said, a man who is too far gone doesn't stand up in the middle of a room full of people and say what needs saying when there's a cost to saying it. He looked at Travis directly. He said, you stood up. That's how I know. They sat in the corner of the room for another 20 minutes and the conversation moved through other things, smaller things. The kind of talk that happens when two people have said the most important things and are now finding out what else they have in common. Travis mentioned the auto shop in a class he had been considering at the technical college in Lexington, engineering something that would use the part of his mind that needed to be used. Walter listened and asked one question about it, a specific question about the program structure that told Travis he had actually been listening rather than waiting for his turn. When Travis stood to leave, Walter said Tuesday. Travis said, I'll be here. He walked to the door and held it open for a moment, feeling the cold, and looked back at the corner table where Walter was sitting alone with his empty glass and the folded newspaper he had not read, and the particular settled quality of a man in a place he belongs to. Then he stepped out into the night, and the door closed, and the October air was cold and very clear, and above the streetlights of Millbrook and Sycamore the sky was full of stars. He stood there for a minute looking up. It was the first time in 8 months that looking up at the night sky felt like looking at the sky rather than looking at everything he was trying not to think about. He stood there until the cold told him it was time to move. Then he moved. The bar closed at 10. Dennis ran through the final routine, the glasses and the taps and the lights at the back, the quiet mechanical liturgy of a place wrapping up its day. Walter was the last to leave, as he often was, though tonight the lateness was different from the usual lateness, which was simply the lateness of a man with nowhere particular to be. Tonight it was the lateness of a man who has been through something significant and is not yet ready to leave the room where it happened. Dennis walked him to the door. At the threshold, Walter stopped and said, "Thank you, Dennis." Dennis said for what Walter said for 17 years of not asking. Dennis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I figured you'd tell me when it mattered." Walter said, "It never seemed to matter enough." Dennis said, "It mattered to me." He paused, and the pause had something in it that 17 years of counter-distance and shared Thursday afternoons had built up to without either of them knowing. He said, "It always mattered, Walter." Walter looked at him. He nodded. He walked out into the night, and Dennis stood in the doorway and watched him go until the tweed jacket disappeared around the corner of Millbrook. And then he pulled the door shut and turned back to the empty bar and stood there in the yellow light for a moment before he finished closing. General Raymond Steele arrived at 8 o'clock the next morning with 2 cups of coffee from the diner, 4 blocks over, exactly as he had said he would. Dennis had come in early to open the room for them, and he left the 2 men at the corner table and went to work in the back without being asked. The morning light came through the window at a low angle, the October light that was different from the summer light, thinner and more honest. It lay across the corner table in a stripe touching the edge of Walter's folded hands. They drank their coffee and talked about the memorial, about the names that would be on it, about the men they had known who were not alive to see their names in stone. They talked about the ones who had made it home and the different ways of not making it home that had nothing to do with the battlefield. The slower losses, the ones that arrived in the years after, and that had claimed more men than either of them could count. Then Steele set his cup down and said, "I need to ask you something directly." Walter looked at him. Steele said, "I called your doctor in Lexington. He wouldn't tell me anything, doctor-patient. But I've sat across from enough people in enough rooms to know what I'm looking at, Walter. I've seen it in your face since I walked in last night. You're sick." The morning light lay across the table between them. Walter said yes. He said it without qualification, the same way he had always delivered difficult information as fact, with the precision of a man who has made his peace with the thing he is reporting. Steele said, "How long?" Walter said, "I've been certain for 14 months. He paused. He said, "I suspected before that." Steele said, "What does the timeline look like?" Walter said, "The doctor is honest with me because I asked him to be. Probably another 8 to 14 months of being mostly myself. After that, it gets harder to say." Steele absorbed this. He looked at Walter, this man he had known for 40 years, who had put 2 rounds into himself at 40 years old to bring a 25-year-old officer home from a night that should not have been survivable. And he said nothing for a long time because there was nothing yet that was adequate. Then he said, "You should let people help you." Walter said, "People help me fine when I need help." He said, "The issue is not help. The issue is the way people look at you once they know." Steele said, "Walter." Walter said, "I know you understand this. You have sat in enough rooms where people look at you a specific way because of what you represent, and you know the difference between being seen and being looked at. I come here twice a week. I sit in that corner. I drink 1 beer and I read the paper, and I am part of this place." He paused. He said, "If people know I stop being part of it, I become the other thing, the thing they are, careful around the thing they are managing toward a conclusion." Steele said, "And you'd rather be the thing in the corner." Walter said, "I would rather be what I have always been in that room, for as long as I can be it." The morning light moved incrementally across the table as the earth carried them both around toward noon. Steele said, "I understand." He said it with the specific weight of a man who actually did, who had sat in rooms where he was the person everyone arranged themselves around, and who knew the exhaustion of that, the cost of being a fixed point in other people's navigation. Walter picked up his coffee. He drank a slow, careful sip. He said, "I thought about stopping, coming here." He said it quietly, looking at the table. He said, "About 2 months ago, when things got a little worse for a while, I thought about just not coming anymore, not making Dennis and George watch the process of it, disappearing before it got to where it was going." Steele did not say anything. Walter said, "And then last night happened." He said it without drama, reporting it as simply as he would have reported a weather condition or a change in terrain. He said, "Last night I sat in that room and watched a young man stand up and say a true thing at a cost to himself. I watched George sit there with his bourbon and his patience and his 20 years of knowing what he knows and never needing to say it. I watched Dennis come out from behind his bar for the first time, and I cannot count how many years to say what needed saying." He paused. He said, "And I thought, I want another Tuesday. I want another Thursday. I want to sit in that corner and be part of that room for whatever time it gives me, and I want to do it without asking anything more from it than what it already is." He looked at Steele. He said, "That is what last night gave me. Not what you said, though. I am grateful for what you said. But what the room did, what it turned out to be." Steele looked at his old mentor, this man who had taught him through example what it meant to lead without needing the room to know you were leading, who had been sitting quietly in a corner for 17 years, being exactly what he had always been. And he felt something move through his chest that he was not going to name because naming it would reduce it. He said then, "Take your Tuesdays, Walter. Take every one of them." Walter said, "I intend to." They sat until 9:15 when Steele had to leave for the ceremony. He shook Walter's hand at the door, and it was a long handshake, the kind that says things that have already been said and are being said again because some things deserve the repetition. Then the gray suit and the silver hair went out into the October morning, and Walter heard the car leave and sat back down at the corner table and finished the last of his coffee, which had gone cold. Dennis came out from the back. He said, "Do you want a fresh cup?" Walter said, "No, this is fine." Dennis went back to his work. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, Travis Weaver came in through the door at 4:15, a few minutes after Walter, and hung his jacket on the hook near the table and sat down across from the old man. Dennis brought 2 beers without being asked, which was a new development, and set them both down and went back to the bar. Travis reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set a plain white envelope on the table. It had been delivered to his apartment the previous Thursday. No return address, his name printed on the front in block letters. Inside had been 2 sheets of paper, a printout of a public records military service search and its results, which contained a name and a date of birth and a location and a single line of text at the bottom. No military service record found. Travis set it on the table and looked at it. He said, "Someone sent this to me. I don't know who." Walter looked at the envelope. He did not touch it. Travis said, "I thought about what to do with it." He said, "I thought about going to Henderson, making it formal. I thought about tracking down the people Brandon told his stories to and making sure they knew." He paused. He said, "I kept coming back to the fact that the room already knows. Everyone who was in that room on Thursday night knows." He said, "Is that enough?" Walter considered it. He said, "What does the paper tell you that the room didn't already know Travis thought about this?" He said nothing. Walter said, "Then you have your answer." Travis picked up the envelope and folded it once and put it back in his jacket pocket. He picked up his beer. He said, "Dennis." Dennis looked up from the bar. Travis held up the envelope. Dennis looked at it for a moment. Then he said the room handled it. He said it the way you say something that is the end of a subject rather than the beginning of one. Travis nodded. He set the envelope back in his pocket and left it there, and he did not take it out again. The 2 of them sat at the corner table in the late afternoon light, which was shorter now that November had arrived, coming through the windows at a steeper angle and spending less time in the room before the dark came on. The ceiling fan turned at its usual speed. The television above the bar was showing something with the sound turned low. Outside on Millbrook, a truck passed, and then a car, and then the street went quiet, the way streets go quiet in small Kentucky towns when the afternoon is thinking about becoming evening. Walter picked up his beer. He looked out toward the window where the maple tree stood in the parking lot, its branches mostly bare now, the dead branch still hanging from the same place it had been hanging for, going on 3 seasons, clinging by whatever thread of wood was left, not falling, not quite ready. He drank a slow, careful sip and set the glass back down. He said not to Travis exactly and not to the room, but to something in the direction of the window and the bare tree, and the particular quality of November light that came through old glass and fell across worn tables in rooms that had been standing longer than most of the people in them. Some things hold. Travis heard him. He did not ask what he meant. He already knew.